Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank you for joining us and welcome you all on behalf of the SMPTE Hollywood section to the Culver Theater. It's events like this where, SMPTE really works hard to bring together, industry professionals such as yourself. So it's great to see such an amazing turnout from professionals, colleagues from the media and entertainment industry here tonight. So we've got a very exciting program for you today. It's about being too bright, and with that, I would like to present Linda Rosner, our producer.
Here we go again, because I'm so short. I'm a co-producer with Laura Tommen and Lynette Dunsing from Colorist Society, so I'd like to thank them all and welcome all of you. I think Juan really said it with the dignitaries. So once again, we want to special thanks to Amazon MGM Studios, Raymond Young, Head of Tech Standards at Amazon Studios, Head of Standards for SMPTE, and Culver City's Theater Director of Programming and Events, Tom Beto, for allowing us to hold the events here. Also, Tom happens to be the projectionist for tonight. So Tom, wherever you are, I hope you're in there. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Colorist Society Hollywood, and to Lynette Dunsing and Lou Levinson, who helped design the program. And special thanks to Rafiq Gugas and Brian Gaffney, who I drive crazy and who I drive the craziest the most, my co-producer, Laura Tommen. And also, if you parked just below this theater, you will not get validated. Or your parking will not get validated. I will validate you, but your parking will not be validated. So you'll have to park either across the street or at Trader Joe's. And then also, as you know, feel free to enjoy your food and drinks in the theater. Please clean up after yourself when leaving the theater. And if you're not a member of SMPTE, please join. We need members. And now, please meet our moderator, Colorist Society Board Secretary and Director of Marketing Development, Sarah Priestnall.
Thank you, Linda, and welcome everybody. I have an amazing panel of colorists here tonight. I'm so excited to introduce them all, and some really amazing people in the crowd as well. So I think we're going to get really good questions that I'm going to hand off to them, because I'm probably not going to be able to answer them myself. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Lou Levinson, who is a distinguished engineer at Apple. He's going to argue about his title, but we're going to go with Lou. And I'm going to play his slideshow. Sorry, apparently I'm ignorant. All right, Lou, off you go.
So thank you. Wow, there are a lot of people here. This is very cool. A couple of things I need to do first. One, my title at Apple is in fact Distinguished Engineer, which I have complained on many occasions that I am actually neither distinguished nor an engineer, but it works. And also the caveat that I am doing this, but I am not doing this in any way, shape, or form as an Apple representative. So please keep that in mind. I will answer questions, if I can, about what's going on at Apple, but don't expect a whole lot.
What's going on at Apple?
Nothing. It's a big round building with nobody in it right now. Okay, so what is Too Bright? I'm going to be looking down here trying to read it because I did not memorize it. And I'm going to shift one. What is Too Bright? Is there such a thing as Too Bright for storytelling? And we have a whole bunch of questions that are going to arise in the here in the HDR era, which we are just beginning to open up, or at least some of us are. Some of us have been blowing our eyeballs out for a little bit longer. How much dynamic range do we need? How much actually gets used? How much can we humans actually stand? Perceived versus actual brightness. And I may say a few things at some point about what is a reference display, since I think it's kind of related. So as a little bit of history, this sort of hit me when we shifted a Dolby projector that we have from 108 nits to 300, and we started looking at stuff large scale, very bright, and stuff started looking too bright. And another thing that happened is at about the same time we got a 4,000 nit peak reference display in. And when you see Apple's screensaver that's shot in the Arctic of ice floes in broad daylight at 4,000 nits peak, which I can't begin to reproduce here, it caused a lot of issues, and it also caused us to realize in projection that you can't put your hand in the light path. It gets too hot, so it's really something you do not want to turn around and look at it if you can avoid it. So we're going to go ahead here, and the whole purpose of trying to do this is to get people to ask questions, because I don't think we really have any solid answers for anything that's going to be coming up tonight. And it seems, if there is such a thing as too bright, it seems to depend quite a bit on context. Are we, what are we doing? Are we trying to adhere to existing creative intent? Are we expanding the boundaries of storytelling? Are we trying to maintain creative intent in a non-reference environment, which that could be a whole panel all by itself. What is a reference environment? And here, like I said, we're not trying to define anything, we're just trying to answer some questions. So, context. If we're adhering to creative intent, which has been sort of, as a colorist in my career, something that we've been trying to do for decades and decades, we'd like to be seeing the story as the creative author told it. Even now, reference viewing conditions are varied, and how well our reference displays actually do their jobs should probably be looked at a little bit more closely than we do. And there are some intriguing examples we can bring up in a bit. And then there's the question of intent from past eras where we really don't easily know what the creative author actually saw. Some things we have videotape references, we can go back and look and said, well, this is what the creative author saw 15 years ago. The downside of that is I've also seen cases where somebody has taken a master that was created in SMPTE phosphors at 30-foot Lamberts on a CRT and put it up on a 709 projector with no black and said, yes, this is the reference, this is what they wanted. And surprisingly, it took them weeks and weeks to even get close, and the director never quite figured out why it didn't look right. But those are the pitfalls. And, again, what did the creative author see? Some of the material dates back, especially in photography and very early movies, back into the 1800s or farther. And when I put that in, I was thinking of cave paintings and things like that. If you're in France and you're in there, like, if you really wanted to see what the guy who painted it saw, what does it take? Do you have to light a fire? Do you have to burn the right kind of wood? What is that about? But again, we have to question it. Even with restoration and things like that, there was an era where people were using carbon arc to light these images. And that, if you've ever seen it, looks significantly different than xenon, and it looks significantly different than this or laser illumination. So keep in the back of your minds whenever you're looking at something, it's like, how are we seeing this? Because we may not be seeing what the person who did it intended us to see. Another thing that's part of context in terms of brightness is expanding the boundaries of storytelling. Are we doing new stuff? Are we trying to make new footprints on the beach? Or, are we freeing ourselves from previous limitations? That I thought about putting a line in from the 60s, which is when I came of age, and it would have been in bad taste, so we avoided that. But HDR display, in my mind, is still a moving target, and it's still evolving, and more people at this point have access to disseminate their stories in terms of games, immersion stuff, YouTube. There's a lot more content that's capable of being created now, and the question is, what are these creative authors intending? How are we seeing that? Do they, the language of visual storying itself is evolving. It can evolve quickly, and one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, because we can, is it? Is it really evolving? Are we being stuck in old footprints and things like that? Who knows? Those are questions. More context. Maintaining creative intent, or new creation in non-reference environments. What does it mean to try and look at creative intent in an environment where it was never intended to view? And as someone who does work at Apple, that's the kind of thing we ask ourselves if you watch Lawrence of Arabia on your phone on the beach. How close are we coming to what Lawrence of Arabia really looks like? And you'd be surprised. There's still some work being done on that, but that's also a question. Do we want to define some of these new environments so that we're all talking the same language? Do we just let it rip for a while and see what happens? How do we deal with this? In the example of trying to look at something outside, that can demand the amount of light from the display that's well beyond any defined reference or, in fact, any reasonable ability to actually make the display do it without either eating the battery up in 4 seconds or lighting your hand on fire. And then there's, again, something we worry about as a computer maker is multitasking. Not that I believe humans can do this. I don't think we multitask. I think what we do is time domain multiplex. We pay attention to one thing at a time and switch back and forth. But when I mean multitasking in this context, what I'm saying is it's fairly common for people on our devices, like a laptop, to have a movie running, to have UI for something going, and to have a couple of other things going. And then how do you get them all right if they have different creative authors at the same time? Something else to consider. And then how much dynamic range do we really need? Do we really need to go to 10,000 nits? The goal ordinarily would seem to me to match capabilities of human vision. We aren't really there yet, either in the display or capture. And note that matching human vision doesn't mean matching the story to reality. And this has been something that colorists and others have been dealing with for a long time. It's like, yes, VFX people need to know what the light was doing on the set, but when it comes time to tell your story, you probably don't really care much about what the light was doing on the set. So keeping that in mind too. And of course, we're doing stuff that can require beyond P3 color volume and brightnesses in some cases that are very high, and computer-generated imagery like what Pixar or Electronic Arts can do, especially when they put their minds to it, can really cause the need for some of this HDR stuff to actually get nailed down, and we can use it. How much dynamic range do we really use? One of the things we do at Apple is look at statistically all the stuff we stream out that's HDR. How much of it's really hitting peak at 1,000? How much of it's really hitting peak at 4,000? And is that due to adherence to legacy visuals when it's falling short? Are there other factors? Hopefully, the presenters we have lined up will all have different ideas, and there will be different reasons for why things are being done that don't quite necessarily seem to line up with what we could be doing. And quite honestly, what we do is probably more important than what we could be doing, because now we're in the land of creative choice, and that's where those of us who deal with the creative side of all this would prefer to be. How much dynamic range can we stand? There's a question. Our eyes can take in a maximum of about 20 stops of range, which is a contrast ratio. If you measure it and we want a number, it's about 1,000,000 to 1. It must be noted that there are light levels below which we don't see color, so some of that, if you're telling a color story, may or may not be usable for you. And there are light levels above which will suffer damage if we actually look at them. So we're dealing with quite a large working palette even now. And then we have the issue of perceived versus actual brightness, and this has to do with the fact that those pesky observers that we tend to be turn out to be, we're evolved for adaptability, which means what we're looking at actually changes how we see it. So there's a constant ongoing change in our perception as we adapt to the pictures we're being shown at the moment. And does the size of the image affect how bright it is as we perceive it? There's anecdotal evidence for this. There's anecdotal evidence against that. it would seem that creative intent is elusive under the best of conditions. Things like if you're trying to make a scene look really dark and really red, it gets less dark and less red as you're executing it while you're grading it, so you have to make it darker and redder because everybody's adapting and you're shifting range on people's eyes. And, there are some things that we as colorists do that you just kind of never think about when you watch it because we don't always think about it when we do it. And if sadly our good buddy Josh Pines isn't here, but he and I have had talk about this as a doctoral thesis for some ambitious soul, if any of us actually needed a PhD. My anecdote is I actually at one point took a projector, made a 65-inch picture, a 30-inch reference picture, and an iPhone, all calibrated to the same brightness and color space, and put them in my field of vision so they were all the same size visually to my vision system. And to me, they all looked equally bright. So I'm not sure how we perceive that is entirely as variable as we think it is. And a brief departure here for a related issue, which is reference displays. Ideally, a reference display is a display that takes pixels that represent intended light output and makes that light exactly, every time, regardless, in a well-defined environment. And obviously, we don't actually build any of these things. Other than the mathematical constructs, such as the one that's in ACES, which in the ACES pipeline, there is in fact a reference display that's purely mathematical that takes pixels in after they've been IDT'd. I'm not going to go into that, but makes mathematically the light they're supposed to be and then hands it off, but it never really gets to the real world that way. So there's lots of underlying issues, and I've had, again, cases because we do have displays to get high brightness that change how bright the display is depending on how big the object is. And you can actually take, the example I'll use is an X300 because I happen to have one that had its panel replaced right before they stopped becoming available, so it's still functioning. Take an X300 and a 3110, put a 1,000-nit picture up, calibrate everything. They don't look the same. And they don't look the same depending on what the average brightness level is because the 300 on a 10% patch and the 300 full screen do not make the same amount of light. Whereas the other display will give you 1,000 nits no matter what. So all these things we need to keep in mind because lots of stuff is going on if we're not paying attention. So we have a lot of capability at our disposal. We've got a lot of stories to tell and retell, and ideally we want to tell them if they're old stories accurately. And another question I have to ask is, do we have a clue what we're doing? And the answer is, we have a clue, but let's find out more and go to the next presenter. Thank you. Those are my email addresses. You're welcome to challenge me on anything.
All right. Now I'd like to introduce Tashi Trio. Tashi's a colorist and finishing artist who you've probably seen his work. Let me just say he's been spending a lot of time in New Zealand recently over the last few years. He's worked on the most recent Avatar movies with Jim Cameron. So, yeah, Tashi, come on up.
Thank you very much. I'm Tashi True. I'm a colorist. I've been working for about 15 years or so in Hollywood. I know a lot of you guys in the room. It's great to see all of you. Like Sarah mentioned, I have a lot of recent experience on the Avatar films with Jim Cameron, as well as remastering a lot of his previous titles. So I have a interesting perspective on recent CGI films, high frame rate, HDR in theatrical and home video context, but also in the remastering side, which is certainly a passion of mine. So, on the subject of, is there such thing as too bright? Maybe. But I think it very much depends. And so much to the points that Lou made, it's about the context in which you're viewing things in. Obviously, there's what's physically too bright that it's becomes dangerous. Is it too bright that it's uncomfortable? Is there too bright that it becomes an artistic issue? And that is, of course, very, very subjective. So I thought it would be interesting to look back at as many films as I could get HDR transfers of and analyze those. And, I capped out at about 59 films because I ran out of time. But these are films that were shot between 1955 and 2026. And, of course, their HDR transfers are all much more recent. And I wanted to look and see, is there any kind of trend? Is there anything we can glean from the way that these have been mastered? 24 of them were contemporary films, made since 2016, ostensibly in the HDR era, where we're starting to think about things more in HDR terms on modern displays, modern projection. And 35 of them were all released before that. So ostensibly, those filmmakers did not have an imagination of what we would be doing with laser projection, with Dolby Cinema, with HDR home video many, many years before. So I analyze these films, empirically, but also with a little bit of anecdotal analysis for what representative diffuse white, graphics white, and then peak white were in these films. These numbers aren't derived from MaxFall or MaxCLL or any kind of Dolby Vision metadata, because that could be fake, that could be misrepresentative. This is me going through with scopes and trying to figure out what was actually going on in the grading process with this. And if any of you graded these films, you can correct me later on some of the assumptions I make. There are a ton of films in here, and don't judge me. This is not entirely my personal taste in movies, but some of these are amazing films. And I look, these are, in order that they were originally released, not in the order that they were remastered. And you see a whole range of different films here with varying different ratios of diffuse white to peak white. And of those films, the median diffuse white was about 140 nits, which isn't too crazy. And our median peak white is only about 400 nits, but the spread is huge. So we have films, with a diffuse white of only 45 nits, which is kind of, relatively dark, all the way up to 360 nits, which to me is a little bit on the brighter side for diffuse white. And then a peak white of, maybe as low as 60 nits, which is kind of oddly low, you would think, and then up to 4,000 nits in my sampling here. And to explain a little bit about what I mean about diffuse white, the way I'm measuring this is looking at anything in a scene that feels like it's objectively at key and is white. So oftentimes that's somebody's like white collar of their shirt. That's a good measurement since none of these films have a test chart or anything in them. And then, peak white is usually a substantial, specular reflection. I'm using a low pass filter for this, so I'm avoiding any kind of single pixel abnormalities, but looking for like what is like actually a meaningful specular or, bright value that, an audience member would actually perceive. What was really interesting about this was that the older films, so these are films that were produced earlier and then remastered later, with that cutoff in 2016, the older films actually have leaned brighter, with a diffuse, a median diffuse white of about 160 and a peak of about, 550, whereas the contemporary films are all, skewing a little bit darker. So there's some interesting outliers. I thought this was very funny, but the Goonies ranked in here out of the 59 films I sampled as the highest peak luminance at 4,000, but with a diffuse white of about 170. So that's a huge ratio of contrast between a soft white and specular highlight of 23 to 1. Not a film that I would have guessed would be the most contrasty of this batch. The Fugitive, great movie. It's a pretty spicy transfer. Again, not one that I would have suspected. Mad Max, okay, maybe, yeah, that's like a pretty wild action movie, but it's also majorly outdoors during the day, so I probably wouldn't have guessed that one either. Alien and Die Hard both kind of rank in there where like it starts to feel more in my personal comfort zone. I think those are both pretty great transfers there. If we compare Goonies against Night of the Hunter, which is the oldest film in this small catalog, really stark difference. And Night of the Hunter is a film that has been talked about in film school classes and cinematography classes for decades as a really, really representative film of how night should be shot. It's got German expressionism. The lighting really evokes the sense of night. And I remember film school professors saying it's not about making it dark to sell night. It's about contrast. And here we have like the ultimate contrasty film school film, and it has 180 nit peak brightness. There's some interesting films where diffuse white and peak white are the same thing. These are ostensibly SDR films in an HDR container with some interesting choices. 1995's Heat caps out at 60 nits, which is a little dark. Another Michael Mann film, Collateral, also 80 nits, not very bright. Existenz 1999, weirdly, is about 270 nits. So it's a very on the brighter side of films, but it's still very SDR. And I was surprised to learn the new Lady Gaga concert film peaks out at 100 nits. So I would think concert film, well, this is a great avenue for HDR, but it's effectively an SDR movie in an HDR container. A couple filmmakers, in this sampling, I have enough of their films in here to like start trying to build some sort of trend or analysis of. And we look at Ridley Scott's films and you see these numbers. These are not the years the movies came out in necessarily, but the years that they were remastered in HDR. So this is the 4K Blu-ray release of Blade Runner, the 4K Blu-ray release of Alien, and then House of Gucci and Last Duel. And we see that Blade Runner, starts out, a lot brighter. And then as we get down to the later movies, maybe for some reason or another, maybe refining taste or a change in taste, they're getting a little bit darker. We look at Paul Verhoeven. Starship Troopers is again a pretty spicy transfer, not one that I particularly love for the HDR transfer, but then maybe there's a little course correction there. I think that's interesting, certainly not definitive, certainly doesn't prove anything, but interesting little anecdote there. And we'd probably like to know, what's standard, what are people doing, what's kind of the average trend in our industry. I think that 59 films is a good start for a sampling, but hardly indicative of what everyone's doing. But of these, more than 50% of the titles that I sampled had a peak white of less than 400 nits. So they're not all extravagant. They're not all going crazy. Only 5 of them exceeded 1,000 nits. And so I thought that was also surprising, because I felt like from those earlier graphs, it might look like there are a lot of really, really bright films, but they're not necessarily. And I think that right now, to a point that Lou made, we're kind of in this calibration process where we're trying to define what does HDR mean to us as filmmakers, as craftsmen working with filmmakers. And I think like a lot of other, once emerging technologies like Steadicam, drone photography, high dynamic range home audio, or surround sound, there is like a period where everyone tries to go crazy with it, do everything they can, see what boundaries they can push, and then kind of recalibrate as tastes refine, as audience feedback comes in, and as we all kind of evolve as artists. I think that HDR provides a lot of really incredible choices, but it depends heavily on personal taste. We don't have the traditional guardrails that I think were there with SDR, where you had, basic QC reports telling you, well, white has to be, 100%, black has to be 0, these kind of standards. Now it's really up to the filmmakers, and the balance between what is a painterly pleasing image and what might be kind of offensively garish is very much in the eye of the beholder. This is up to the filmmakers. This is up to the colorists who are presenting options to filmmakers, because I understand that most filmmakers are not going to be told, hey, this is a 1500 nit master, and we want to take this approach with it. It's up to us as colorists to present something and say, hey, like, what do you think? Do you like this? What's your response to this? And it's highly dependent on the type of film, like what's the story, what's the genre of this film maybe. And in this case, we're looking at only narrative films. We're not talking about non-scripted content. So if you're making content for Nat Geo, maybe the rules are completely different because you're trying to evoke exactly what real life was like, and maybe we're trying to do something very, very different in a movie. And my closing thought is that, and this is my perspective on it, is that artists, whether they be filmmakers or colorists, craftsmen, you name it, should not feel like we're under any obligation to maximize a technology just because it's there. And I think that there was an early trend in that where people thought, oh, well, there's a 10,000 knit container, we should try to fill that as much as we can. Or, oh, I'm being told I should make 1,000 knit master. And the interpretation of that was often the directive is to produce something with a peak weight of 1,000 knits, not this is the playground you have to work within and you can tailor your art in that way. So just because it's there doesn't mean we have to fully utilize it, but it means that we have a lot of creative potential to do so. So thank you.
Thank you, Tashi. That was amazing to see that kind of historical perspective. And we can talk about this later, but it makes me think like how, Paul Verhoeven, was he involved in the remastering? Was that his creative intent, or was that somebody years later deciding that was the creative intent? And obviously, as we go back further, that becomes more of an issue. And we have Sherry here who's going to be able to answer some of those questions a bit later when we open it up. So I'm going to move to the next presentation. I'm going to introduce John Darrow. John Darrow from, that's not John Darrow. John Darrow from Warner Brothers Water Tower, who's going to talk a bit about something that he's been working on recently that really has pushed the boundaries of what we can do with HDR. So, John.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Well, I want to start by saying thank you for coming out and, giving us your Wednesday night to talk about something that I think is super important. And thank you, Taji, for that. That was super impressive. And it was really cool to kind of see it all lined up and see the trends over time and see how we did kind of start out really cranking it, and then there's a sort of a simmering down. It's too bad that Mike Zink couldn't be with us tonight, because I was really hoping that he was going to kind of talk about some of the information that he's told me and, offline about how certain trends in the consumer side of things, where you see the modes of the TV, like the most when I was looking at his slides at his presentation that he had recently, it said most of the TVs are actually set up out of the box eco mode, and that's people don't touch it after that, so it stays there. So already, if we're talking about reference, like I wish we could just go and like fix everyone's televisions, put it in filmmaker mode. That would be the best. But in light of that, all that we can do is control the master, right? That's the only thing that we have to be able to really put our stamp on. After that, once it leaves and goes into the wild, it's the wild, wild west. So recently, we just finished up the remastering of the Wachowski's Speed Racer. And this thing, if you remember when it first came out, this was cranked, right? Like it was a color punch to the face. And I remember watching this, originally and just going, okay, I need to like quit and go sell insurance or something. This is so good. So one of the coolest things about this was, getting to work on this project, going way back in the day. I remember watching this with my father, and he was a big Speed Racer fan, kind of anime. And when I got to see this film, it was like a live action adaptation of an anime. And so it really was their intention to make this a live action cartoon. So when we start talking about like, what is too bright, right? Really what we got to think about is that's our canvas, right? And you can paint on it however much you want. If you look at, like a Vermeer, it still pops off that canvas because of the contrast between the black and the brightest paint that is on there. It's not self-illuminating, right? It's just paint that is being lit by the environment, but yet it has a quality of contrast. So it's all about the relationship of that luminance. So let's talk about luminance. You got kind of two basic components of a picture, right? You have the chroma, and then you got the luma. There is a reason that we don't do, 044, but yet, 420 is totally acceptable, right? So if you think about like your color gamut, with Rec 2020, we have so much more colors available to us, but it is a function of where that luma is. If you have a luma that is very low, your color volume is going to be squashed as well. Think of it like this. If you take a balloon and you blow it up a little bit, right, one puff, and it gets a little bigger, right? That's your total color volume. But if you blow and do it again, that point away from your mouth gets farther, and now we have a much bigger volume, and the circumference of that balloon gets wider. So now we even have more color at our disposal. So if you think about something like, let's talk about a picture if it didn't have, I don't know, like any luminance, right? What would that look like? That wouldn't look very good. But that's just the chroma, right? But yet, if we go the other way, and we just see a picture with Luma, I don't mind that version. I kind of would be into that, right? So Luma is necessary. It is a must, right? You can't have a picture with no Luma, right? But you can have a picture with no chroma. So we've established that. When you put them both together, oh, okay, now we have the iconic Speed Racer with his costume that is very recognizable to anybody that knows the franchise and loves the character. So when we were remastering, we were saying, okay, what was the original intent, right? We knew we were going to have the Wachowskis in. What is the intent of this film? Well, we started off by going back to the original DCP. Let's watch this. Let's see what it was really, going on in the day. The first thing we had to do was, what source are we going to start with, right? Now, we had the DCP file. We're not going to use that. We had the 709 master as a good reference, but we're not going to use that. So the only file that was logarithmic that we had at our disposal was the file that went to the camera. Now, anybody that's ever worked in a lab knows that that file is in its own snowflake color space, right? It's a bunch of calibrations that happen. You do an inverse LUT. You try to get it into a place that when put through a film recorder, answers back on film. So the first step was, okay, I got to reverse engineer that transform. So what is that, right? So the thing that we had to do was I took the original DCP as a reference and our camera file, and I ran it through a software that I wrote that basically will make a best fit transform for each shot. But what that does is that just gives you every shot, doesn't give you a show LUT. So then I have a bunch of tensors. If you average that together, you average away the individual color corrections. And what you're left over with should be that original transform to get back to that intent. So that's our show LUT now. Now we're starting there. The problem with that, though, is that you're limited to a certain point, right? Like you're just pegged at the original master, which would have been 48 nits. Now, actually, Rich told me to say, okay, well, what's a nit, right? If you think of the original like foot Lamberts, it would have been 14 foot Lamberts is equal to 48 nits. A good way to think of it is like Celsius and Fahrenheit. They're describing the same thing. They're just in different, numbers and metric scales. All right, so if you think about like, okay, now we have this show LUT and it's hitting 48 nits. Well, if we just did that, that would be SDR in an HDR container. Just like Tasha was saying, we don't want to do that. We want to go with the intent of what they were trying to do. And originally, the Wachowskis were trying to pop this off the screen and make it look like a cartoon. So where do we set that point, right? Well, at the maximum. That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking like, let's crank it. Now, where is the maximum? The maximum is only to where your reference can show you. Now, luckily, I've got a 3110 in the bay right now that can hit 4,000 nits. Okay, let's set it there, right? Where does that land? So we built the show LUT to basically kind of roll off at a reasonable painterly level, right? Where it still describes the picture as once was. We're not sticking like, diffuse white at a 4,000. That would be ridiculous. But there's certain speculars that we could use to hit that. So I don't want to be capped with the show LUT. I don't want to be cranking on the gain and going, well, wait a minute, I'm hitting a wall. So I let it go up to 4,000, but where that's actually sitting, we kind of set middle gray a little bit higher, and the reason we did that was so that we could have a little bit more shadow detail. And then where we set that white point was very similar to what the original show was rendering with the nice soft roll-off, but allowing us to go much higher. So let's talk about where that is, right? So when you think about when you open it up to 4,000 nits, you're not just getting brighter picture, right? It's not just about the top of the specular highlights. By increasing that volume, you're actually utilizing that whole balloon, if you want to think of it that way. You can see that in back in the day, 709, that's 100 nits. That's like what your normal TV would be set to, before HDR. We're going 40 times brighter than that. But it's not just about brightness, it's about 40 times as much color. It's not really exactly that way, but you have a much bigger, volume of colors to play with. And not just those peak colors, but all those tonal gradations in between. And that's what's really cool, that you get like a very soft kind of a creamy look that you probably could have never achieved if you were cranking it the same way in a smaller container. So when we were talking about like, well, what does that mean, right? You get a lot, like when you think about like some of the really extreme edge cases of these colors, you think of speeds like Crazy Blue Shirt. You think of some of these CG sequences where we have very, very heavy cyan, like ice cave, kind of like very cool environments. And we can now show, instead of like a magenta blue that was like in the original transfer, you can kind of see that it has like that like sort of CO2 trapped ice, right? Like that cyan that just didn't exist in like a 709 palette. It was kind of cool to be able to like paint with colors that are new, you know? If you think of like, was that indigo blue that is a time in history where it's like, oh, we're using this because this is the royalty color because it's a super expensive paint. Now I have access to it. And then you start to see a bunch of that. And now we have more colors in our tool chest. So it's cool to paint with that. If you look also, there's that very like toxic green, and that's kind of pegging up way up there in that 2020 area. So we talked about color and color volume, right? But now the other cool thing is being able to like really kiss that 4,000 nits. Now, again, we're not using that all over the place, but for things that are motivated, right? When you think about the story, like when do you use that? What would be motivation for that? And it would be like things like electricity. So here's a picture, and you can see that what we have here is you have the PQ 4000 on the left. Then I took the original master and put it into PQ on the right. That's capping at 100. And you can see how much extra we get out of that. Now, these are flashes on screen. We're talking like very, very small, individual frames that are kissing these peaks. But when you're watching it, it's super visceral, and you're like, whoa, that looks dangerous. Like, oh, I gotta look away. And that's cool that we can kind of control that, like a physiological response to where you're like, okay, that seems like that's a bad crash if it's exploding. So you can look that the picture, the guts of the picture didn't really change, right? You can see the mid-gray go up a little bit. You can see that we get a little bit of extra down in the shadows. But the real key here is if you look on the original transfer, we're capped because that was the peak. That's all you ever had, right? Now we're able to go and let those things that were in the original VFX rendering, it's in there, it's in the file, kind of sing and let it breathe. And again, we're not talking about the whole picture resting at 4,000, right? It's just little spikes that kind of help tell the story. And you can kind of see when we use that, right? Like there's a lot of talking head kind of portions of the show where it's just the drama. It's like the tender parts with like Speed and his mom, right? Susan Sarandon killed it in this movie. She's so good as mom racer. And if you look, the race sequences, right, that was where we were really kind of cranking it, right? Because it's fast, it's action, it's like, well, let's really get into it, let's drive. And so by utilizing the canvas in that way, we're telling the story through the energy of the picture. And I always felt like this was a cool way to do this, to show, okay, over time, right? And if you look, you can see that there's, you got the first race. Well, it doesn't really show up all that well. Yeah. So first race at the top, right? And then it kind of settles down. It's like the cold open. Okay, let's do the first race. And then it simmers down into some drama and narrative. Then we have the second race, third race, and ultimately the Grand Prix. And so you can kind of see how that flows along and kind of promoting the story, right? Helping kind of tell, where we're at and how much are we really goosing this. Also, if you look, it's kind of funny. You can see that the 4,000, nits, we're just kissing the top. Most of it is, there's like 2% that's around 400, right? So like it's still a normal picture. We just have the room to paint. Okay, so yeah, that's fine in a theater like this with the lights off, right? But what does that mean when it gets home? And so that's the other thing that, like, to Lou's point, when you're thinking about, well, all right, how are people consuming our media? Well, for this, I would imagine, it's a family film. It might be on the back of like a Honda minivan or something like this, cruising around or wherever this is being watched. You're competing with the sun. So when I say that it's, okay, we're making it bright, we are raising that middle gray. And does it look great in a perfectly dark room? Absolutely. right? But it can also kind of fight with the thing that has the most nits, right? The sun streaming through your room. I always joke with a lot of the television manufacturers. It's like, well, you guys make the smart home devices. Can't you just lower the blinds too when you go into filmmaker mode? Like, let's do that. But since we can't control that, it's not something that you should think about as far as, fighting, incorrect viewing conditions. But you got to think that we're really doing this for the audience, not necessarily for ourselves in a completely dark room. So as much as you can do to make the master that will hold up the best, I think it's a valid point and something to consider. Because again, all we're trying to do is just tell the story and make sure that it looks good wherever that media is being consumed. So we're talking about, is there such a thing as too bright? We'll get to that. But is there such a thing as too dark? And I do think that there is, right? Especially with compression technologies and again, the way people consume media, whatever your bandwidth is, you can grade something in a perfectly dark theater that you were like, nailed it. Look how good that is. And then somebody gets it home and somebody's online going, it's just a compression mess. I don't see anything. What's going on? So I do think there is such a thing as too dark. Now, the question is not that, though, today. The question is there something that is too bright? I don't know. I don't know. I don't think there is, as long as you have a why for doing it, right? What's your motivation behind it? What are you trying to do? And it was just such a happy time to see the Wachowskis come in and put eyes on this for the first time and just be jazzed and be like, yeah, you nailed that. That's the intention, right? We wanted this to be a live action, jump off the screen, in your face anime. And so it was really kind of just a highlight of my career so far to kind of be able to push this to the max. So really, back to what I was saying, it's like, just let the story dictate what you're doing. As long as you have a good why for it, there's no wrong answer, right? Do whatever looks the best, but use the entire canvas if you want to. Use it limited if you feel like that's telling a better story, right? There's nothing wrong with dim pictures. It just needs to fit the narrative. Perception obviously is relative, so take into consideration where the image is going to be displayed, and if you have the nits and you feel like using them, don't be afraid to do it. Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you, John. I think that's a great example, like Speed Racer. I saw it when it came out. Even when the original came out, I was blown away by the colors and everything. So I think I can't wait to see the version that you've done. I'd like to bring you all up now, Tashi, John, Lou, and introduce Sherry Eisenberg from Warner Brothers Remastering, and Doug Delaney, senior colorist. Come on up. We're going to take questions. The first seat's mine. Everyone.
I'll go to the far end.
Oh, no, we're so
Taking a water.
Please, feel free. Just
All right. Okay. I'd really like to hear Sherry's perspective on remastering, because I think that's a really critical point when you don't necessarily know what the creative intent was. How do you deal with this bigger container than you ever had before? Sherry, do you have an opinion on that? And then we'll go to the audience.
Yeah, but I interestingly can comment directly on Starship Troopers. I did do Starship Troopers with Paul Verhoeven in the room. So he was there. And 2017 is almost 10 years ago in HDR, which it seems like eons now. And I feel like at the beginning, the filmmakers would come in the room, and I do think sometimes we were pushing it. I think they were excited. I think they were excited about the technology. I think they were excited about seeing their films in a new way. And it might have been a little spicy. I haven't seen it in a while. So the one thing about these versions are, because they are a new version, we're obligated to let the director know that we're doing it. It really is a new version. And after watching all these really incredible presentations, I realized how intuitive I do my job. I'm not that nerdy. We look at prints, we look at references, we look at the film, we look at the story, and we try to walk it into this new world as elegantly, with as much discretion, and try to honor some of these older films the best we can. Some of these films, some of these noirs, have no business being super bright. And some films, which are not really that old, but still are 30 years old. If you think of Desperado, it's not really like an old film to me. Actually, I don't call those films old. They're classics. But some of them really take on a whole new life in these worlds. And the filmmaker comes in, which he did, and we really try to take advantage of breathing new life into these films. But when these people are gone a long time ago, we really try to approach it with caution. I feel like when you're sitting down and watching some of these films, Maltese Falcon, I'm trying to take you back in time so that you feel like you are watching the film, maybe for the first time, when it was released. I take it seriously about how the film should feel, what's too bright. I almost feel like if I'm asking, is it too bright? It probably is too bright, just because I'm feeling it. But I work in a different world than a lot of other people. A lot of people are on newer content, and those filmmakers are in the room, and they might be like, yeah, let's really go. And sometimes I can really appreciate that. But other times I feel like discretion and restraint is just as important. So I guess that's my take on it. I don't really worry about the nit level. A lot of times it's just, I just realized after watching all this how intuitive it really is for me. I kind of just sit back and, does it feel right? And that's not a very scientific answer to is it too bright? But at the end of the day, that's kind of where I live a lot day to day.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, colorists kind of live at the intersection of art and science, right? So, Doug, I'm going to introduce you if you'd like to say a few words about how you've dealt with this.
Yeah, is this thing on? No. I'm a colorist, not an audio person. Oh, there we go. Yeah, great presentations, all of you. I really enjoyed it. It was really insightful, Tashi, that the trend of starting strong. I remember we were together at Sony and working for a company that also made TVs. I think there's other influences at play as well. Crank It to 11 was part of the conversation sometimes. I remember Love, Death and Robots, the very first season, animation, right, which you guys have a lot of experience with as well. As a colorist, it's how you present it. So this is an example, perhaps, of how you don't present it. So, it came in Aces. They hadn't, experienced HDR at all, and I was like, "This is cool." It was sort of sort of photorealistic animation, lasers, like crazy opportunities, explosions. I'm like, yeah, let's go for this, right? And so I let it rip, and I was vibing. I was like, this is going to be amazing. And they come in, of course, and I meet everybody and get to, talk, get the eyes adjusted, dim the lights, and hit play. And it's a 7-minute piece or something. And I hit stop and turn around and, what do you guys think? And they're just looking at me like I'm fucking nuts, right? Because in animation, they had been looking at it for a year and a half a very specific way, right? I didn't present it. That was an own goal, perhaps. But we ended up settling into something, and it was a presentation of what's possible, but doing it as a sort of steward of the image in a responsible way was, that was an early lesson for me, just as a moment of humility, right? And so I think that those are those are extremely important conversations to have with filmmakers. And this is maybe the subject of another panel discussion. We could talk for hours about this need that we have to straddle of serving two masters, right? This is, even in live action, how many, there's probably got to be stats of how many films are actually, or TV shows are shot and monitored on set and dailies and HDR. Probably not a lot, right? I'm going to guess. And so what's everyone used to looking at? And we come in and we can kind of create something else, but that's not what I meant, but that's kind of cool. But now we have to also make an SDR, and that's something else. And how do we bridge those things? Again, this is a conversation we can have maybe on another night. But that's something that we have to, as Sherry said, I'm kind of that same mind. It's very intuitive when someone says, how many nits is this? I'm like, I don't know, but do you like it? That's, honestly, a lot of my approach. But yeah, I think this idea of serving two masters is something that we have to reconcile somehow. Creative intent. What is creative intent? Well, it sort of depends,
All right. Yeah, creative intent seems to be the key thing here. Let's take questions. I think Linda's ready with a mic, so.
Yeah, that's true.
If you could just say who you are before you say the question, that would be fantastic.
Hi, I'm Charles Bunag, also a colorist. This question is for basically all of you, but Tashi, you did 2 giant VFX movies, Avatar. I've been dealing with a lot of HDR content as the master, but we'll get work in from ILM, Weta, and all these guys, and they'll be like, oh wow, we didn't see it like that. Well, yeah, they've all been monitoring at 100 nits 709 because us colorists took all the X300s, so they're looking at really good prosumer monitors, but in the end they're generally looking at it in SDR, checking their work in log to make sure that all of the mats and everything is correct. But when we get it, we're going to see a lot of detail that no one had ever seen before or intended to be seen. Sometimes that works out great. They're really happy and they want me to work with it. Other times they're like, can you find an in-between? Or other times, like when Iron Man's eyes just had 3 LED dots in them, like, we're not supposed to see that. We were never supposed to see that. How was that experience for you? Was the whole thing kind of monitored ready for that, or did you have to do a lot of work when it came to HDR trims to get everything back to the right intent?
Good to see you. Well, so for the Avatar movies, the Weta pipeline is very robust, and with any modern VFX pipeline, we're dealing with 16-bit EXRs, so we're not super compromised in terms of highlight or shadow detail, which I think is where HDR starts to break things the most. If you start aggressively adding contrast, that's where you're going to start seeing noise issues, especially in film scans. I think that film scans, or if you're adding synthetic film grain, that's a point where, whether it's CG or not, you're going to start to have some issues in HDR that are more prevalent than before. But yeah, we didn't have to really treat anything extra carefully on the Avatar films. Weta is primarily viewing on monitors. They have a small theater, so they're viewing things in essentially SDR projection down at their offices, and then mainly more for stereo issues. We see things that they don't see, and then we call them up the street and we're like, hey guys, like we're seeing something, you're not seeing it, we're not explaining this well over the phone. So we have them come in, and as soon as they see it on a 45-foot Dolby Cinema screen in 3D, they're like, oh, that's just so obvious. It's usually really small stuff like that, mainly on the stereo side. I didn't have many issues specifically with HDR or even with headroom on the films. More in the shadows, we kind of run into issues where I think that the CGI renderers, like, there's always a ton of noise in a CGI renderer, whether it's RenderMan or Manuka, which is Weta's proprietary render. You spend more compute time and you get less noise, but the noise is mostly prevalent in the shadows. So what I see a lot of VFX companies do is in comp, they actually kind of cull out some of the shadows. So well, we can bring down the highlights significantly and retain detail there. If we boost it all up, we actually just see there's just a floor where there's nothing in the shadows. So maybe that's an issue if they're not nailing the exposure, within a stop or so, or 2 stops. I don't know. But yeah, long story short, we didn't have any specific problems to that effect.
All right. Anyone else want to jump in on that, or should we take another question? John?
Well, just something that I do. I mean, the CG rendering is always kind of something where it's like, all right, they've been used to monitoring it this way. If you color manage your pipeline, something that I tend to do a lot is when I send things off to visual effects houses, I'll always build in, I'll change the show LUT by giving me a little bit of a thicker negative, if you want to think of it that way. So the show LUT, once the VFX goes through the pipeline, I actually have more sitting down in there, and they've been monitoring it that way where it's like, okay, if I did need to bring up those shadows, it exists. So please light to this if you can. Now, you don't get that on every show. It's usually just people that you've worked with for many, many shows where you have a shorthand and they trust you to say, okay, you can set up the color pipeline. So often you don't get that luxury. But when you do, then you can kind of control how, all right, I know you're going to be seeing it in sRGB this way. When you come in for HDR, it has that same roll off. It's just maybe spread a little bit larger, but you're not seeing things where it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much detail in the clouds. That was never what the artistic intent was. So it's always best to be sure that you're using some sort of like color management that from editorial all the way through to finish. And even what Doug was saying on set, we do want to see more of that happen. I think we are starting to see a little bit of that happen in production, but not nearly enough. HDR monitors on set would be huge.
Yeah, I think, because I used to work at Avid, I think HDR monitors and editorial might be a good idea too, right? Because people get used to what they're seeing in the edit, and then they're like, oh, that doesn't look like what I saw on my crappy SD monitor when I was editing. So,
but to do that, then you'd also need HDR dailies. That's a whole
that's
nother,
actually
that's
getting
a whole
to
nother
an-
panel.
Exactly.
An interesting issue of another thing that affects all of this is the financial aspect of it. What are people willing to pay for? And that can be a limiting factor as well if you can't have monitoring on set or you can't have monitoring in VFX.
Picture business? What?
But you have an HDR monitor on set and an SDR monitor on set, and the DP might understand that, but other people on set are like, that's what serving 2 masters. Which one am I supposed to be looking at here? Which is right? That looks better. That looks terrible. But that's SDR. And, it solves a problem and creates another one.
It's kind of like the old dilemma of, can you shoot for 185 and 235 at the same, or 4x3 and 185 at the same time as can you protect? And it's like, yes, but you really only get one composition.
Common top or something.
For the creative author part of it.
I do want to comment on the space when John was talking about the very large container. What's happening a lot in restoration, of course, if when possible, we're going back to the original camera negative. And of course, the cinematographer was well aware of the dynamic range on the negative. And by the time he printed down, he knew exactly how that light was going to behave. So now you have no ceiling. And so all the sun is seen, which is supposed to have this bright, blinding light, it's just a light on the negative. And it doesn't look like the sun because there's basically no ceiling.
Flare characteristics of lenses and things like this.
They knew exactly. It would just clip and look like a really, really beautiful bright sun, which you can totally see on the print. It looks amazing. And then what you have to really do is go back to the importance of remembering the creative intent, because HDR just doesn't have any. I mean, the ceiling is so far away that you really have to creatively step in and recreate for that cinematographer that feeling he knew was going to happen when he printed down to that print.
Yeah, and you even get into situations where there's stuff done in the lab to the prints that if you have the negative and you have a good scan of it, you still don't see what the creative intent is. You need to track down an actual print. Hopefully there's one in one place. One of the beauty of some of the older stuff is you might actually get a dye transfer print, so you know you're actually looking at something reasonably close, but sadly in a more modern era that may not happen. You may get thin and purple, right? So
All right. I'd love to get. Okay, question. I'm gonna.
Oh yeah,
ask for
Alex
cinematography
Forsyth.
next. Alex, yes, go,
I
Alex.
guess just color scientist, I guess. This is right along the theme of what you guys were talking about. There's a little bit of a setup here, but there's a question at the end, I promise. So I've always sort of had this theory about how cinematographers light, and I was just talking to someone in the lobby about this, in that they light with fill to key ratios the way they do because they have an expectation and an understanding of what's going to end up on the screen. I mean, we can see the dark side of the face without the fill light, right? But as soon as you put it on screen, it fills in and you can't see anything, so you need that fill light. And with HDR, there's a completely different set of rules. And I guess my question is, are you guys, as we start to see HDR monitoring on set and in editorial, starting to see the images come in a different way, lit a different way, that allows you to explore the space differently and has different expectations for how the image is going to show up on screen, versus something that was lit for 2001 dynamic range or something like that, coming from film with the expectation that, the whites are going to be at 48 nits and the blacks are going to be, divide that by 2000. Are you guys sort of seeing different types of images now than you did previously?
I will say just real quick, maybe more pragmatically, with Alexa 35, Luxie 4, the headroom, less getting in the color room and seeing sky panels out the window that they never meant to see, or even frankly sensor clipping, more sort of pragmatically, cinematographers on set understanding that they need to protect for this additional headroom. Surprisingly, you still see clipped images. I don't know if you guys experience that as well, but I still see, highlight sensor clip of maybe not protecting, only looking at the 7 to 9 or something like that. But I would say, to answer your question, Alex, at least sort of pragmatically, I absolutely see that. In terms of sort of energetic differences, I'm not necessarily consciously seeing that. Maybe intuitively that's happening, but I'm not, for myself, seeing that.
One of the things that, there it is. One of the things that virtual pipelines allow us to do, right, Alex, is make some of these decisions a little later. If we make sure that we don't lose detail that we want when we're shooting, we can then pass off some of those decisions to later. And how do you, when you're looking at on set, you can't necessarily tell that. I mean, I've shot an entire test things where the only thing I cared about was I clipping detail on the set, and everything else was done later. And to some degree, flexibility is good, but you have to kind of be planning on it first. Does that make any sense?
I guess I'm wondering, even somebody in front of a bright window, right? Where previously they might have had to go so bright in order to make sure that blew out.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with dynamic range is if you want it to go away with the tools that we generally grade with, you can make it go away.
Yeah, well.
If you want it to come back when it's gone, good luck.
Yeah, you guys
That's
can
a
push
good point.
pixels around in a way that, yeah. But it's do you see the images coming in with sort of greater dynamic ranges where it's they blow the window out even further because they could see it on set in HDR and they want it to be white. So all of a sudden now what's out the window is a lot brighter than it was previously. I mean, it was bright previously because they knew it was going to blow out, on film, or it was going to blow out, in SDR. But now it's just, X number of times brighter, lit brighter, because they could see the detail on set, and they were like, now we need to make it go, even brighter in order to make sure it doesn't show up.
Like a loop, like a feedback loop.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems is we're just getting to the point where cinematographers can really see HDR on set, right? It's always been an issue where they haven't had monitors on set to see it, so they haven't really been able to light to that, even though it was possible to do that. So I think now we're really getting to the point where we can get those kind of choices.
I think we're conflating 2 points too. There's the capture aspect of it, right, and that's your negative, and then there's the print, right, and this is your show lot and how you're rendering the picture, right, and as long as that is being controlled and you're in partnership with your cinematographer. The way I always look at it is that I work for the cinematographer. I work for the camera department. Let's build that stock. And now that you have the stock, you know how that's going to be repeatable on set. And so to your question, I do see that mid-gray is coming up, but the way that you roll off the top end, that's still to taste, right? And what is too spicy, right? That is such a choice from the cinematographer. And you just want to make sure that you tone map that correctly to every target, no matter what that target is.
Yeah, I think there is a subset of cinematographers who are more, maybe they're in the color suite in this HDR era, more reps, maybe more able to predict what that exposure is going to be in SDR on set through dailies, and then HDR it's going to be that. And I think, I think there is a subset of that happening for sure. But I don't know, at least I haven't experienced someone sort of intentionally going crazy, knowing that, I mean, like your example. I haven't experienced that, no.
Oh, I think we have a question over there first, but then we'll...
Right here, and then I have Paul, and then I'll get to I've got Ryan.
Yep. So I'm Jim Hellman from Movie Labs, and I wanted to kind of validate some of the things that went into kind of the current specifications that go back 14 years ago to 2012 when we basically convened Dolby along with the studio CTOs to talk about developing HDR, ST2084, and eventually bringing it to the ITU with BT2100. And one of the big questions was, we talk so much, 10,000 nits, 10,000 nits, is actually what should that peak be? That was actually an open question at the time. It was driven a little bit by what the capability of monitors were at the time. So Dolby had, the Pulsar monitor that could do 4,000 nits. It's partially driven by how far you could go in terms of peak luminance on the PQ curve before you start getting quantization effects at 10 bits. And we really didn't want to go beyond 10 bits. And eventually, kind of they say, well, do we go 20,000? Well, probably not. It's pushing the quantization limit. 10,000? Well, do we really need that, or is it 4,000? And some of the arguments that were made at the time to put that at 10,000, and there were two of them, maybe three. One of them was, I think, what we see a lot of in terms of peak white for specular highlights, for things of that sort, where we had all these numbers about, well, in real sunlight, the reflection off of a chrome element on a car versus diffuse white is, a ratio of X. In order to get that, you need to have that much headroom, even if it's only a few pixels on the screen. One of the other arguments was really to what John was talking about in terms of color volume, which is I have a highly saturated color that is very bright, something that's neon. And also in that context, sometimes animation was brought up as a place where sometimes you get, certainly you have the opportunity to go to much more highly saturated colors than, say, 100 nit or 1,000 nit peak white would enable you to go, when blue and red only contribute a small amount to actually the actual Y luminance value. So I'm curious, looking back now, 14 years later, are those valid? Do you see places in, like Speed Racer, you mentioned they really wanted to punch that saturated red, that blue. How far did that actually go in terms of, how far up the limit for red or blue did that kind of peak out at? And, outside of lightning, how often do you see, small amounts of specular highlight in bright sun that actually end up being the thing that pushes you up close to that limit?
Yeah, it wasn't a lot. I mean, as far as like the actual like peak hitting on the luminance, but now the color, to your point, that we used quite a bit. Now, if you think about where red sits and where blue sits in P3 versus 2020, there's not a huge difference between those two values. But what is really interesting is when you take that green and you push it way out there, what I do get is more cyan. And that was really the key, was being able to hit that, not the primary colors, but the colors that you get that are pushing when your volume gets larger, being able to see a cyan that you could not get in P3. And so I think that's where we really utilized it the most. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, the one of the interesting things about PQ that we don't seem to notice is in that 14-year period, or however long it's been since we started doing that, people are using PQ to process stuff, whereas its original intent was just to get stuff to your house without being able to see quantizing and stuff like that. And there's, limits to what PQ will do in highlight detail. And the minute you start fooling with that, you start seeing cracks in how functional PQ actually is.
One day we'll all live in a linear world.
One day. I mean, we do. We just don't.
You're right, exactly.
All right, Paul Chapman.
We just don't see that way.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to stand up and point out that I'm wearing 18% grey, so no controversy.
Good man, Paul.
Because
Well
you're
done, Paul.
English,
As
Paul.
is John
You're
there,
English.
so good job.
Yes, but what's the light illuminating?
There you go.
It's kind of a
I
mix,
really
low
wanted to
CRI.
bring in a different subject, which is temporal effects of HDR. How high can you go before you start to fight judder? And I know probably, John, maybe you experienced this with speed rays. I haven't seen what you've done yet. I'd love to, but I haven't done it yet. But I know this is an issue where the brighter you go on high motion, and maybe Tashi as well, because I know this is something you guys. I mean, you're lucky that you have a lot of 48 frame material.
Well, we've been warning people
Yeah,
who have been wanting to go, well, we have
Yeah.
all this stuff in the vault
I went
that's
to see.
SDR, and we now want to make it 1,000. What are
Yeah.
we going to see? And you're going to
Yeah.
see everything that every one of us has hidden because it was only 100 nits.
Right, and I went to we saw Mandalorian this weekend, and I thought that could have really benefited from being at 48 in places, because it was a lot of high motion fighting and stuff. And anyway, but definitely the temporal thing is something I'm interested in as well.
Absolutely. Luckily for me, the temporal hits were in lightning strikes, which are by nature kind of, impulsive and juddery, and like it was actually kind of adding to it. So I didn't really hit anything like that. Now the Mach 5 happens to be white, but that was not sitting anywhere close to that. You're around like 300, maybe that's at maximum on the car itself. So the other thing that was kind of lucky, I guess, was that there's a bunch of streaks that happen that are trails off of the car, and it's meant to be like motion blur, like speed. And what's cool about that, they were very highly saturated colors. And so even though they're, it's 24 frames a second, so you have 24 samples, but because of the nature of the trail of it, it's actually helping that out quite a bit. So it was like the perfect project for that. I wouldn't do this, every day, but it fit the material.
Yeah,
Actually,
and,
could you talk a bit about Avatar and what you did?
Yeah, so I mean, both Avatar 2 and 3 were mastered in 48 frames a second. Primarily for 3D and 3D in Dolby Cinema, which is kind of that double whammy where in 3D you're much more sensitive to judder, and then at that higher contrast ratio, all of those old ASC recommended pan speeds, those all go out the window. Those were all based on 2000-to-1 contrast ratio at 14-foot Lamberts on a smaller screen. So yeah, it's all relative, and if you crank something to 1,000 nits, it becomes really really problematic. Even in 2D. But yeah, so there was a conscious decision there, to make as much of the film's 48 frame as possible, when it was specifically to address judder, not for any kind of additional creative narrative choice, but really just for judder in 3D. And then for the Billie Eilish 3D concert film we just did, that's all mastered for 48, captured in high frame rate. So the whole show is shot in high frame rate, and it really does it does take on a different feel, and you get kind of used to it in HDR and in high frame rate. That I found it actually pretty enjoyable, which is not something that me 10 years ago would have thought I'd be saying here. I would have thought like, oh no, high frame rate, motion smoothing, all that. But when it's tastefully done, when it's intentionally done, and it's not an after effect of television motion smoothing, then I think it can be really good. But yeah, it's tough, because how do you author content for that? If you know that you're going to have an HDR master, but you're also going to have an SDR master, and it's going to be shown in the dark, and it's going to be shown really bright. Like, how do you make something that is perfect? How do you make a decision that is one size fits all? Like, you really can't, because if you shoot for high frame rate, well, then you're going to have a sharper shutter angle perhaps. So how does that work best on every display? We have to kind of decide where is our median audience maybe, or where's the milestone that matters most to us, and that's a highly subjective thing.
Your 48, is it delivered at home at 48 if I want to watch it just 2D, or is it 24?
No, so the home deliveries are all 24 2D, but there's potential for a 48 3D VR kind of release. But yeah, that's so much of that is limited to the home video distribution. Does a particular streamer have support for that? Like, your TV can technically do it, but there's no 4K Blu-ray spec for 48 frames a second. So yeah.
Hi, my name is Larry, and I just would like to say first off that I'm into the all things future-proof concept. And what I mean by that is whether we need more dynamic range, more brighter image, we should always strive for the maximum for flexibility for a consumer, so the consumer doesn't buy into one standard and then realize that now we've got it right, we've made an improvement, buy this now. I'm not in that obsolescence game. I used to have weekly conflicts with Doug Trumbull for several years on, let's not just be better than the competition. Let's just do it right the first time. And there are only two people that I know of they're in the audio world that has embraced this concept. And that's Edgar Schwarry at Princeton with his Bach 3D spatial audio technology. And he's still got some further work to do for multi-listener, but what he's demonstrated in single and up to 4 people demonstration is unbelievable. But as it relates to the topic here, I think we should again maximize dynamic range. We should go for CIE 1931 color space instead of Rec 2020. And as far as the comment that Doug made on the ambient light, there's a solution to that right now, and it's called Carbon Black Pro, the carbon nanotube screen that Liam Mahon has invented. So I encourage everyone to go to that website, Carbon Black. This is not an endorsement. I'm just letting everyone know it's Carbon Black technology. And so that's my... and by the way, and computational imaging is, I believe, the future for acquisition. Single lens is eventually, I think within a couple of years, is going to be dead.
100% agree with a lot of that. When we archive, we do go far outside of 2020.
That was my comment. That was my all-inclusive, to the best of my ability comment. No. Please.
Does anyone want to comment on his comment, or do we go to another question?
No, that's just all I want to say. Is that when we archive, we do archive typically in ACEs, and that we definitely are covering far outside of 2020. For exactly that reason, future-proofing.
And also back in 2012, 2013, we were looking at possibly XYZ as a distribution format to consumer as an option to Rec 2020, but it takes more bits.
No boundaries. Yeah, I'm with you.
Hi, Theo Gluck here. It's sort of more of a follow-up what Sherry was saying. I worked more on older titles, specifically at Disney. And when we talk about what you didn't see originally when the film came out, what you can see now, a dye transfer print hid a multitude of sins. So no one has seen what Fantasia looked like scanned. So, when you're working on something like anything from Bambi, or for that matter, Black Narcissus or The Red Shoes, who speaks for Jack Cardiff, who speaks for Michael Powell? So it's a question of not being the only person in the room with those ideas. Triangulate between best existing masters, what you're seeing now, and personal opinion foisted as fact accomplishes nothing. And we worked with Lou on Mary Poppins many years ago, and we were able to get our hands on a dye transfer print from the original release. Interestingly enough, shot on Eastman Color Negative, but it was a dye transfer print. So just more of in light of the world we're talking about right now with the avatars of the world, we all have studios in this town with a lot of material that needs to be either tarted back up or continue to be worked on because it can be monetized. So it's a very difficult line to toe to make sure what intent you are after. I'll leave you with one presentation I gave. Someone asked early in the days when we were looking at HDR for Snow White, and we hadn't made a decision yet, but someone asked, what are you going to do with those? I'm like, the bottom line is, our charter is not to make Cinderella and Snow White look like a Kardashian sister. And that's pretty much what you have to go for at that point is, I agree with Sherry, go with your gut. How many knits is it? I don't know, but it looks great. And as long as it can be mastered properly, that's where you go.
It should still feel anachronistic. I agree.
Well, I think
absolutely.
It's kind of like, what would the creative want? Do you go with what the creative wanted back then, given the restraints that they had, the constraints they had, or do you go with what they could do now, right?
Well,
which is a completely different thing. Or where do you balance that in between?
Whose mind do you try to read? The other big thing is, and certainly in animation, you can see a lot of paint flaws, mistakes, which you can fix in a nanosecond now, digitally. Because what would Walt do? Go like, you want a fresh one? Because what would they have to do to repaint, reshoot? Assuming they even looked at it a frame at a time that we are now.
You say mistakes. I call that charm.
Well, and you can look at Star Wars, right? When they remastered Star Wars, and they could see all the matte lines.
Exactly.
Originally. But they made a decision to get rid of those because that may have been in the original, but it wasn't really the creative intent. It was just what happened at the time.
Exactly. That is just the accident of that birth, but you were now able to correct for that. So, but fascinating, all of you. Terrific. Nice to see you, Lou.
Okay, I'm getting down to Brian Gaffney, and then I've got a number of others, but this is great. I will not forget you, ever.
No, we need Stephen. We definitely need Stephen Poster's perspective.
We need Stephen Poster. Brian Gaffney.
Thank you. Great panels, everyone. So we all lived through that digital to film transition where people were cutting editorial, but then we put a film print on, and they're like, what happened? So you brought up this whole thing about SDR to HDR. Should we really now be considering HDR dailies when we are capable of it with Avid and storage versus still, it seems like all my shows are still in DNX 36. Like, what happened? Why won't editorial move forward? Do we need to force that subject, or is this still just going to be a playland where we decide creative intent always at the end?
I mean, I think I brought this up. I mean, I think, I remember Leon Silverman talking a long time ago about, the edit room being the kind of hub of everything. That's where the director sits for months, right, doing what he's doing. He's looking at the screen. And I think, as Lou said, I think it's an economic decision as well. Like, you can't just get all those, you have to, there's a massive amount of monitors out there that have to move to HDR, right, to get to that point. And they have to be calibrated, which they're not. And you have to stop the editor from just going, oh, I'm just going to bump up the brightness a bit because I can, and it's a whole system-wide problem, but I think the dream is that we'll get there at some point, right? So
yeah, I don't know if every film has to be HDR necessarily either. I guess to the point, right? Like, is the goal is that all films are mastered in HDR? I mean, to future-proof it, sure, but to present and sort of be able to create an HDR-ish image, sometimes yes and sometimes no, and I think that's an individual creative choice by the filmmakers. I don't think it's, I don't know if that would be a mandate, like the show has to be, unrestrained 1000 nit.
HDR
depends
does
on the
not
show.
keep us from displaying an SDR image regardless of how we're doing it, right? You could do an SDR complete production if you really wanted to, even using some of the tools being HDR. You just have to be aware that that's what you're doing, right?
Can't you buy like a HDR display for like $500? Like the argument that
Not a good one.
Not a good one.
call it 1,000, you're spending $5 million on a movie. $1,000 to get a
You'd be surprised.
It's not a
You're
technology
new to Los
problem. It's a
Angeles,
courage
right?
problem.
color forward companies in the world. Doing HDR is not hard.
No.
Ryan's point, doing HDR dailies in 2026 is not a technology problem. It's an acceptance.
Yeah.
It's a courage
You're preaching
problem.
to the choir, 100%.
Yeah, you need somebody to stick their neck out and go for it.
Keep talking about it, right? We've talked about it for a decade. HDR displays are not hard.
Mhm.
It's a pretty simple problem. It's saying, hey, editorial, here's an HDR display. I don't care. It doesn't need to be an X310.
Yeah, but then you have to say, make sure you have the right LUT applied and blah, 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 and then their eyes glaze over. And
Yeah.
they're simple to you, Brendan. They might not be
Be
simple
surprised
for
how many
everybody.
simple problems,
Yeah.
hairball things.
But again, as I say, I think it's about serving multiple masters, and then assuming that it's an HDR first show. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think no one's going to disagree with what you're saying, but I think the pragmatic sort of friction points of VFX, the comp supervisor, everyone's QCing in HDR in a calibrated environment, editorials all in HDR, everybody's in HDR, and then that becomes that's a shift that I think we would all love. Who's
You
ready
just need
to
the
do
right
it
team
first?
to do it first. Yeah, exactly.
So I had a quick question. I'm Hayden Bandies from Deluxe Media, and this is for John, but this is also just a question outside from a colorist perspective. And you mentioned how difficult it is to work with darkness. So out of curiosity, would you say that brightness is an easier sandbox to play with than darkness? And could that change in the future with cameras that can capture expanded dynamic ranges and improvements in lighting?
Well, no, I mean, I think that, if you lift up where your mid-gray is sitting, right, then you have extra shadow detail that you can still make dark. It's really how you come in and out of blackness, right? Like it's that toe of your curve that really matters the most. You can have a very, very dark image, but you want to make sure that it's not just completely, detailless, unless that's what you're trying to do. There was a show, it was Annabelle, that was a while back, where the director said darker, 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 darker. We hit right where you could not see the creature and went one step back, right? And so if that's the intent, that's great, but you just got to make sure that you're not completely destroying all of that detail in the bottom end. You have to have it go very softly into black.
And you do have to realize that at that end of the scale, you're going to be far more dictated to what you're seeing by the ambient, by your reference environment, not necessarily your display. So if you really want to tiptoe down in the Prince of Darkness region, you really need to be sure that your ambient and your backlighting and all of that are such that you can reproduce it in the kind of environments you want. And that's something that a lot of display manufacturers are now dealing with. Is like, how do we compensate for ambient and still have the creative intent that we always wanted to have?
There would be those times in a projected, still really, frankly, but like where, digital projection, P3 grade and the blacks are kind of grayish, right, as we all love. And, director's in the room and it's like, can we go darker, darker, darker? And it's like, it just looks muddy. And then like, there's something that highlight in the background and I just make that brighter. And he's like, that's dark enough. Yeah, all the time, right? Because you can't go any darker; it'll just get muddy. So you make something brighter, and it feels darker, and that's the game you play.
sometimes I would just put a black, and I'm like, that's black. that's nothing. That's the starting point.
And that has its
None
own
more
story.
black.
There's no point in black has a place in the world, and it's okay to get it to the point where you actually can't really measure it very well.
Spinal tap line there, right? Black.
Hi, my name is Kehan Baigan. This is a fairly non-technical question, but it's kind of dressed as technical. In HDR, we don't have something similar to gamma, for lack of a better term, but so we're all kind of mastering for a relatively singular gamma, so to speak, for most of the image. I am curious, since the canvas is bigger now, how do you formulate different environments that people are going to be watching the film? When I'm doing SDR as a colorist myself, I always guess how it's going to look like in a different gamma environment. So I kind of try to stress test it for different types of conversions that might happen. I am curious if you A, think about something like that, and B, since it's a new discussion, how do you begin to formulate that in your head if you want to approach it artistically? Since Tashi mentioned there's like different diffused white points, and where the middle of your image sits, but because we have a higher contrast, how do we stress test our image for different corticals?
Some of that is what Sherry says. Careful. It's what feels right.
Yeah, and some of it's just being careful to the details of what you're really targeting, because you can have 1,000 nit PQ signal in P3, and you can also make 1,000 nit gamma 2.4 signal with P3 primaries, and if you've done it right, they look just exactly the same. Right, that's the point I made way earlier, is that environmental stuff is also affecting, and one of the things that we don't really have, that I can see at this point, is we haven't really nailed down the definition of what the environments should be. And once you've made your creative intent decisions in an environment that's controlled, then potentially you have the ability to have a display that says, okay, I'm getting pixels and I know what I'm supposed to do with them, but I have this ambient light thing going on that I'm also aware of. And how do I compensate that to get you to think that it looks the same?
It's unfortunate that we don't have Mike Zink with us tonight. We were planning on, because he would have a lot to say about that. It's really what we have to hit is the target, right? But then how it gets to the consumer is a whole different conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the company I work for does a fair amount of that, and it's still a challenge.
Yeah, reference mode, right? On the iPad.
Yeah.
No. I mean, just literally this morning, I'm on the phone with the DP doing the review file. It's just a review file, and he's like, "It looks dark in reference mode." I'm like, "Just put it closer." And he's like, "Oh, okay, yeah." I mean, honestly, because it's a 12-inch.
Yeah, go in the bathroom, shut the door, turn off the lights.
Turn the lights in the room down.
That too.
Back when I did commercials, it was kind of like, yeah, we're looking at this commercial in New York, and it looks really dim because it's a trailer for Roger Rabbit, actually. And it's like, so how are you looking at it? It's like, oh, well, we're on the 47th floor with the windows open in broad daylight. It's like, try pulling the curtains and see if it looks better to you.
No, but like in this example, it was dark, but the iPad was here, 12-inch, and if literally you bring it closer, it feels
inverse
scale. Yes, right. An anecdote to say scale does matter.
So it's not just environment, but
a lot of
viewing angle and all that.
It's an onion, and the more we peel it, the more we see it's an onion, right?
All right, I'd like to ask Stephen Poster to speak, because I really wanted to have a cinematographer on the panel, and here he is in the audience. So.
Oh, me? Oh, okay. If you really want to think about future-proofing, you better start thinking about multispectral. Every manufacturer is thinking about it, and that's going to change everything we're talking about today. That wasn't my original question, but I'm going to leave it there.
Now I want to know what your original question was, too.
The original question had to do with aging eyes, and I'm not talking about just about cataracts, but I mean, everybody has a certain curve that we live with until we don't live anymore. But I think sensitivity changes with age, and that's something that you must, as colorists, consider when you have different people in your room. I mean, I've had arguments with directors who found out that they were not seeing as much as they thought they were.
Yeah. Well, none of us observers, in the Huntian sense of an observer, none of us see the same anyway.
Exactly.
And one of the things that colorists all have to do is you have to very quickly decide how different is he seeing from me and how do I deal with it.
But multispectral will help.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
We have Jimmy.
Jimmy Fusel, Post Guy. Hey, great presentations. The name of the presentation is "What is Too Bright?" and I'm guessing that's a question that's asking itself either because you're getting feedback that stuff is too bright, or that people in your bay are asking you, "Is this too bright?" Which is not my experience. The question that often comes from a studio or from an audience is that things are too dark. So I heard one story from you, Doug, about like people who had been unprepared, I guess, and expectations not set about what they were seeing. But are you really getting those questions of, is this too bright? Is that where the problem is? I'd love to hear why this topic and not the other one, I guess.
Well, it kind of started with me with just noticing that our ability to make things brighter in terms of peak bright was just getting to the point where I was noticing it's like, wait a minute, I can't think of, and I've had a fair amount of work across a lot of different spectrums, but we're getting to the point where I'm not sure I can quite grasp a story that actually needs this to be told. And that's kind of where I started with all this. Like, it just looked too bright to me. And in the cases where I, in fact, was the creative author myself, I started asking myself, is that something that I'm going to use? Or is this so damn bright that I can't even put my hand in the light path, or I've blown a hole through the lens cap on the projector because I inadvertently left it on when I fired it up? I was going to bring a picture of that. I melted a lens cap with a 300 nit Dolby projector. Blew a hole right through it.
And maybe it's it's a question of visual language and sort of kind of standards and what we think is a good image, what is a good image, and taste and how we've developed and how we've trained. We've looked at images for decades. Many of us, the match clip on the light box with a loop. I've did that for years as a film scanning recording guy back in the 90s, and saw that transition, and you do that over and over and over again, and that develops your sense of taste and expectation and understanding that process. And now we have something else, and maybe the question isn't necessarily, is it too bright? Is it okay if it's brighter? Maybe is a better question.
Or phrase it a teeny bit differently: is there such a thing as too bright? Which is different than is it too bright, right?
Yeah. And John, I really liked your sort of approach to it, and it's something how you presented with your sort of creative approach to Speed Racer. It's something I always think about and I've said it many times before about audio levels of 84 dB, but you don't put dialogue there. Like, it's not a movie of people screaming. It's just a movie of people having a conversation, and then there's an explosion or a car flipping over or whatever, glass breaking, and those are your sort of peak transient sort of instances. But it's a I think a broader sort of aesthetic conversation about visual language and how that's developed, and the Netflix look, and how we're changing the way we think what we think a good image is, and so maybe it's not necessarily, is it too bright? It's more like, is that okay that it's that bright? Question mark.
You know what I think, Jimmy, is sometimes we're a bit of a moth to a flame with our eyes. And so I try to really remember, somebody's decided where in the narrative where they'd like our eyes to be. And sometimes if you just throw something in there that's really a bit too bright, you've lost the plot. And so that's really the thing to kind of keep in mind, is we can be a bit of a moth to a flame sometimes.
Just use it like punctuation, right? Like salt is good, but too much ruins the dish.
I just a complete non sequitur, and apologies, but just I've been doing this a long time, and I look out and I see like some people in the audience that I've admired and I've respected for many, many years. So this is kind of a crazy, cool moment. So
powerhouse audience for sure.
Seriously, there's some really brilliant people out there. So thank you.
Well, I think we're going to have to do a follow-up of what is too dark, right? Maybe next part 2.
Oh, I think Tom's going to do it right now.
Yes, I am. Jimmy, thank you for stealing my question. You
Good
guys
job,
basically had it in your slides. You said, Tom Graham from Dolby, by the way, sorry. You alluded to, Tashi's great study on these titles, and John having the slide is really, what is too dark. And I think what I see in my 10 years of doing this in this industry is that we have a reference monitor now, the X300, that has set the gold standard of black. It's basically in SDR, it's an HDR monitor. And by telling someone it's okay to make 100 nit PQ on that monitor, and the mids keep dropping, and then the picture keeps getting darker, and that signal then translates to a living room in PQ, and no one can see it. Mm-hmm. And yet the SDR signal, when it transfers to the living room on an SDR gamma TV, that stretches it to 800, 1200, or 1400, or 2000 nits, or 300 even. We now have an experience differential that is not what was created and intended, of saying, I can just make my SDR and my HDR the same, 100 nit PQ, and I'm good. Because it's not. That's not a real world thing. So I would, Sarah, to your point, love to have a follow-up panel on sort of the real world, and maybe it is a full pipeline story all the way from on-set, dailies, editorial, VFX workflows, all the way through, and then to the consumer living room and that experience.
And one of the things about that that's kind of insidious that we don't think about a lot is the fact that let's assume that we could magically convert from an HDR picture to an SDR picture. But that doesn't guarantee we're going to tell the same story exactly in the same exact way. Even if you have a shot that you think transfers and you look at it going, yeah, that's exactly kind of what I would do in SDR. It's like, but that's not good for the story. I need to change it. So it's really story forward.
I keep saying we needed zinc here, because exactly what you're saying is that you think that, okay, this is your SDR at 100 nits, but when the TVs do take that and put that at not at 100 nits, that's a very different conversation, right? And PQ being, perceptual, like it's going to be the same no matter what the screen is if it's tracking to the PQ curve. So the bigger issue that I think it's two things. It's one, it's delivery, right? But the other one, if you flip it, it's how we've tended to work. Often, at least in my band, I'm sure it's the same in your guys' world, it's usually big screen first, and then we get along to the HDR after. Even when it has been HDR first, because of working in sRGB the whole way through in visual effects, we usually start there and try to inch up instead of saying this is the range, the canvas that we have to work, and now is trimmed down. If you think about it in audio, they always start with the Atmos mix and then go down to 5.1 and then go to near field. And I'm not 100% sure why we don't work that way, but again, that's a different conversation, probably for a different night.
I actually prefer grading in HDR first.
Oh, me too. I still
100%.
do. I will have the monitor up even if they're looking at the projector.
Yeah, 100%.
I actually prefer grading at about 90 dB instead of 80.
All right, next question.
Yeah, but it's as you say how we're used to working, and I'm working on a feature. We have to be in a big room on a big screen, and it's the presentation of it, which that's not invalid at all. But I feel like as a colors from a sort of accuracy point of view,
Nuts
I
and
feel
bolts,
like HDR grading is the way to go. Primary.
Hello, my name is Dmitry Rusanovsky. I'm in video compression and video delivery technology development. And I would like to thank you for nice panel, for nice presentations. I would like to follow up on this recent question and discussion of what followed that. So 10 years ago, when HDR was standardized across bodies, there was two competing concepts. Reference display method of HDR production is PQ and hybrid log gamma by BBC and NHK. That would allow you stretch transfer function and achieve dark in living room scenarios. And for PQ, I believe concept was that we do grading on reference display 4000 nit, let's say, and after creative intent on the range of displays of lower peak brightness, let's say 1000 nit, 500, 300 nits, would be achieved by use of HDR dynamic metadata that would ensure creative intent delivered to that level of brightness. And when you say in the what is too bright, it means that it's probably delivered with wrong brightness to the customer, and it means that probably dynamic metadata either doesn't work or is not being used. So my question here is that is HLG registered in your development in any form? And second question, in your production grading procedure, do you produce and certify dynamic metadata that deliver creative intent to lower grades peak brightness displays? Thank you.
I'll answer it with a bit of a 45-degree slant, if that makes sense. There are things that have been found that HLG is actually kind of good for in terms of bit depth and things like that. When you look at the original purpose, which was like to be able to do things like simulcast a soccer game in HDR and SDR at the same time, I have yet to see that work.
To answer your metadata point, yes, everything that we always master a full set of Dolby metadata with all of our masters. The one thing I've started to do that I never used to is actually put in more points along the way. So I never used to work in 4000 nits, and now even if I'm not using it, I'm putting a point there for nothing else than to lock it, right? That's really the only change there. To Lou's point, HLG, I think, has a story when it comes to live broadcast and just making sure that you're sending a signal that will be good on every display, not necessarily having to dynamically map that. Although I've seen really cool stuff coming from Netflix on the live side of things that is in HDR that is PQ that looks amazing. So I think that maybe that story might have lost a little bit. It's mostly PQ for me. I don't work in HLG a lot, if ever, actually.
Jay-Z.
We can hang and have drinks after, though.
Exactly.
See, economics gets everywhere.
Always. It's always.
Yes, Joachim Zell, Imaging Science of Barco.
We all know you.
Information for John Darrow. The reason why the guy is not here, his name is Michael Zink.
Okay, I'm screwed it up.
Yes. So it's 9 o'clock now, and nobody answered what is too bright.
Yeah.
I would like to give an example.
We
now
never were
at
going
9
to.
o'clock. So if you look at a scene and there's a lot of real estate at 4000 nits for 1 minute, and you cut to a dark scene and you see nothing, this previous scene was too bright. Because the iris, or no, not my colleague, the pupil, the pupil is closing. If there's a lot of bright light, the pupil is closing. It's an analog device, and if you then cut to a dark scene, you don't see anything anymore. So you need to, as a colorist, it's my question now, do you need to grade HDR in sequence, right? You always need to look at neighboring scenes.
You always have to watch it in sequence when you're
always,
done.
Yes.
It is moving
But there's no
pictures.
such thing as
Motion
too dark
pictures.
either, right? So if I'm the creative author and I want you to see nothing when that happens, I've been successful.
I've told this story before, so sorry if you've heard it before, but I like using that technique where you will adjust. And now I've set keyframes, but you're doing it in your head. That's great. As long as that works, then all of a sudden it's like, well, this is pitch black, and you slowly adapt to it. If that's promoting the story that we're telling, that's a really cool thing to do. And we haven't really had that kind of physiological effect in the SDR world. Now we can start to experiment with that.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Thank you for great presentations tonight, Oliver, Ojil, colorist. Quick preface before the question is, from my experience, and this has a little bit to do more with the demand side of our industry, is that I, almost on a weekly or project basis, as I encounter with directors, but mostly DPs, is how little they know about HDR. And so many of them, and I've been in many situations where it's episodic, I don't want to say names, but like $7-8 million per episode. The DP just doesn't even look at the HDR, and they come. They've done the whole ingestion, monitoring on set in SDR. They do the master grade, with me in SDR, and then they just sign off. And they kind of, I guess it's a good thing they trust me to carry that creative intent into HDR, and then with what is too bright is just a personal subjective thing. So my question is kind of, how much do you guys encounter this in your day-to-day practice as colorists, that the DP side of the director side of the question is just, we need to sort of educate them more about this whole process, so that there's a more, I would say, of an intent of actually finishing in HDR, and also maybe one day monitoring and just doing the whole thing from top to end. Thank you.
Well, I'm willing to bet that they know more about high dynamic range than you might suspect, because we've been capturing high dynamic range since probably about 1940 or 1950 in film. Now, the point you're making is, yeah, they're not thinking of using it as a delivery, but the beauty of the current world we live in is those are choices we can make. We haven't painted ourselves into a corner. So that part of the education is simply, again, expanding our storytelling potentially.
Yeah, I think it's also pragmatic. Frankly, even in episodic, sometimes the pace is such, and if they're prepping, they're the first block DP, and they're prepping for their second or third block, I guess, and they don't have time to come. There's sometimes pragmatic reasons why they're maybe unavailable, or if they're remote, if they have the ability to do remote HDR reviews reliably on reference mode with the iPad 6 inches from their face. But there's but yeah, absolutely. I think there's intellectual curiosity, openness to the change of, as I say, visual language of what is HDR, what does that mean, how can I as a cinematographer leverage that? I think these are all valid questions, and I think there's varying degrees of adoption and understanding, and frankly rejection sometimes.
And we're all learning, right? I don't know how to tell stories like the filmmakers that I work with, but I learn something from them every time that I work with them, and I hope that it goes both ways.
Yeah, I think what we're hearing really is, what we do is a blend of science and art, right? And it's above all else, it's a collaboration process. So that's filmmaking. It's collaboration, and it's art, and it's science. So
a foot in both.
Yeah, and I think that the choice to work in SDR or HDR is such a subjective one. I think that your question presupposes that HDR is inherently better for a film, or that a filmmaker is under some sort of mandate to deliver that. And as a DP, if your choice is to have an SDR type look, or that's the style you're going for, then that's it. That's your creative intent. If we look at Adolescence on Netflix, that's highly regarded for cinematography. It's a 100 nit show. Is it a little bit dark? I mean, in my living room with the lights on, yeah. Is Michael Mann's Heat at 60 nits a little dark? Yeah, in my living room, sure. In the room he mastered it in, where the man said it had to be that way, it probably looked pretty good. Train Dreams was nominated for Best Cinematography. Would you believe that that's an SDR show with no HDR delivery to Netflix? How about that? So, I mean, it's a creative choice, and I think that one side of us wants to propel technology. We want to say, oh, there's this new thing, let's play with it, let's see what we can do, and that's exciting. But we also have to respect that when an artist says, this is what we want, this is the look that I've crafted, whether it was on an SDR monitor or not, or it's in sRGB, and they say, this is what I like, I feel like I have to take that at face value. I have to believe them that as the artist, this is their intent. And we can challenge that. We can say, hey, well, do you want to try this more? And if they say no, okay. I mean, like that is what they want to do. And it's a back and forth. And I mean, that's any kind of artistic collaboration is how far do we push it, or where do we settle on this? And it's going to vary film to film. And the weird thing about HDR is that PQ is absolute, like we've said. So, if you prescribe this scene is going to be 100 nits, this could be at 100 nits regardless of whether you're in a bright room or a dark room. And that's the real challenge there for us, I think, is how do we creatively author something when we know that there is no arbitrary offset? Like, and we joke about, audiences who, leave their TV on eco mode, or they leave it on sports mode, or mom and dad have motion smoothing on, whatever. But I think there are a lot of audiences who we have to trust them. They know how their TV looks best in their own living room. And if they are most comfortable looking at 200 nits but gained up to 300 nits, who am I to tell them that they're doing it wrong? Like, I know it's the filmmaker's creative intent and all that, but like, they bought the TV and they bought the Blu-rays, so let them watch it in the way that's most comfortable for them. But HDR, or let's just say PQ, as a concept, kind of takes that away. And I think the natural calibration from here, as we're now like 10 years into doing this, is to balance back to something that takes into account ambient light, that takes into account the viewing conditions, because that is such an important component of the equation that I think we're often forgetting.
All right. Thank you, Tashi. I think we are done. And
I'm so sorry. Yes, I cannot thank the panelists, Sarah, and you amazing audience members.
Thank you all.